Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. Good to have you again along with us. Thank you, Mike, for joining me. Joy to hear your thoughts as I conclude these 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 5 chapters that are commonly grouped together as to where Jesus said them and when he said them. And as we finish this up tonight, next time it'll be chapter 18 when he enters into the Garden of Gethsemane. So this will be our last chance to listen to Jesus, talk to his disciples. And in this passage, John 17, he's actually going to pray. So as we get into this, Mike, it's listening to what's often called the high priestly prayer of Jesus. And if we could ever hear Jesus on those numerous times that he'd get alone and pray, it could have sounded like this. This might be a model of how it sounded to hear the Messiah pray to his Father. So I've often wondered how we got this material. This is not in the Synoptics. John 17, very private prayer. It could have been overheard by those around him. My guess will be, in fact, as we even get into it, let's just begin, Mike, and I'll show you my theory on when it was said. John 17:1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, Father. So now we know we're in prayer. Let's review our chronology that we've been dealing with here in John. John 13 through 16, I've recommended, happened back in the story that's in John 12, verses 1 through 8. It's picked up again in 13 to 16. So the 6 days before the Passover, this conversation among more than just the 12, but other people who were in the room, Lazarus and his family and such, and those who knew Lazarus were probably there in that villa during these times. Now, John 17 is this prayer that is bounded on the far end by 18:1, and it will say, then when Jesus finished, they crossed the Kidron Valley into the Garden of Gethsemane. So we know in 18:1 that we are in the evening of Friday or Thursday night into Friday morning of the actual weekend of Jesus' death. So my theory, and it's hardly a theory, I think it's just a matter of common sense, that Jesus' prayer here in 17 happens somewhere between Saturday and Thursday of the Passion Week, and it could have been anywhere. Really, right? It could have been anywhere. And was it something that was overheard by someone? Probably not. My guess is that, here's my theory again, just a theory, that Lazarus, being the beloved disciple, was so close to Jesus, he was the best friend that Jesus had, that somewhere during this week of time, as he was thinking about, the passion that is to follow, knowing what was going to happen, that he got alone and prayed. And Lazarus, not necessarily overhearing the prayer, but knowing that Jesus was in the next room or was over there, behind that stone or something, he asked Jesus, so what did you pray? And Jesus told him. So this would be Jesus retelling Lazarus what he prayed, and Lazarus putting it into some kind of a memoir, which is then given to the ultimate author of the book that we'll talk about in chapter 21. So can I prove any of that? No. But nobody has any good way to know how to record Jesus' prayer except someone being given this information after the fact.
And Ron, I would also want to just maybe point out that, for the listeners, because I think oftentimes when we read the scriptures, we sort of have an internal clock running. We assume that all these events happen in a linear sequence, that they happened like almost one right after the other. Maybe 30 minutes afterwards, he looked up to heavens and prayed. Yeah. Versus really all there's a time compression, and there is no given chronological timestamp in this moment. Just simply, we just know after Jesus said this, and that after could mean a whole week or sometime
and I'm
in
going
between.
to deal with this in 18:1 when it says after he said this, after the prayer, they crossed the Kidron. So I'm going to deal with the actual Greek text itself in 18:1. And it's the same in 17:1, that this tauta is, when Jesus had spoken these words, that's not a time marker. It is a sequence marker of some kind, but it's very loose. And it's not bound to minutes, hours, or even days. Yep. It just means next thing. And we don't have any sense of time marker. So what does Jesus pray? He says, Father, the hour has come. The hour meaning he is right upon, he knows what's about to happen. He's been angling toward this since, I know, in Mark 8, to use a synoptic gospel as time marker. This was a good year and a half that he has told his disciples that this is going to happen. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you, since you have given him authority over all flesh. To me, 17:1 and 2, as we get into this now, if, whatever verses you being the audience want to grab onto for your Trinitarian ideas that, again, you unpack in a full doctrine called the Trinity, to be some of the greatest verses that we can grab onto are in the early verses of John 17. Since you have given him, he's talking about himself, authority over all flesh. Again, think of the throne room scene of Daniel chapter 7. To me, this is what's happening. Let me just read what I have on the screen for those of you that can see it. Again, this is something we've talked about, but when Jesus says authority, all the authority that you have given me, that phraseology, this is what it's about, Daniel 7. And the reason I bring it up again is because I went through 4 years of Bible college and it was never mentioned. I know in a Bible survey class we might have hit Daniel 7, but when I think of my evangelical heritage, even of my master's and doctoral work, and not that, again, I'm expecting every teacher to go to Daniel 7 at some point, but it is interesting to me that in my Bible teaching or training on a bachelor's and then master's and doctoral level, Daniel 7 did not get the kind of time that I think it really deserves in the biblical story of who Jesus is. That, in other words, if I was to teach even Awana to kids today, I would get Daniel 7 in there pretty quick. Very quickly, because it is so pivotal to the story of what's going on, both in the Old Testament and the New. So let me read what I have here. At a critical moment and this is again background, so for those of you who know it, but pardon me. At a critical moment in the history of God's people, the Babylonian exile, think of when this happens. They are in a critical moment of God leaving Israel in the hands of pagans, right? Daniel envisioned the Ancient of Days, the old man, literally is how it reads, or that idea, but of course we know that to be the Father, Yahweh. He envisioned him take his seat surrounded by countless attendants, thousands upon thousands, 10,000 times 10,000. These beings are not angels. So that's where if you're dealing with bad angelology, if you're reading a text and says 10,000 angels, it doesn't say angels, and I know it wouldn't, because these are not messenger beings. These are divine courtesans, or these are the ones who rule with Yahweh in some real sense. They are created Elohim who serve Yahweh and participate in his administration of the cosmos. The greater the king, the greater the court. And this is how Yahweh is shown. And then following again Daniel's verses, the court, quote, sat in judgment, and the books were opened, offering classic council imagery. God is presiding as the supreme king and judge, while the host of heaven stands as witnesses to his rule and to his verdicts. So in a picture, of course, here's how I have envisioned it for my classrooms over the years. A bar enosh, that's Aramaic for son of man, or a human being. He comes floating in on a cloud and is presented in front of Yahweh by these hosts. They bring him into the courtroom. So let me read what I have again. One like a son of man, just means human being, appears in the throne room and is presented by the attending Elohim to the Ancient of Days. Instead of being expelled from God's presence, which we would expect, he's a human. You don't go there if you're human. This human receives authority, glory, everlasting kingdom, suggesting a kind of participation in the divine authority that elsewhere in the Old Testament belongs uniquely to Yahweh. It is a stunning moment in the history of mankind, if not the biblical story itself. This moment is more than just the rise of a new king. It is about God installing his chosen ruler over creation in the sight of his heavenly council structure. This is DCW 101. We have divine beings bringing in a human being and presenting him to Yahweh, and Yahweh saying, that's the one. That's the one to whom I'm giving everything. Most interesting of all, this ruler is a human. So I'm not taking away from the deity of Christ at this moment. I'm just saying that the text emphasizes his humanity at this point, and that's what's so shockingly, I was going to say strident or stunning about this moment, is that these divine beings are allowing Yahweh to give to a human being all of his glory. Here's the actual verse again. This is all review, but this is what Jesus is referring to in John 17. To him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. Daniel 7:14. This is what is celebrated in the New Testament. This is why it's so critical, because in Philippians 2, I think he's just reciting a hymn that the early Christians sang in verses 5 through 8. Christ Jesus, though he was in the form of Theos, did not count equality with Theos a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of anthropoi. There's that human being in Paul's mind. Again, how you mix the deity and humanity is not the issue to Paul. It's the idea that God has given to the Messiah his ultimate authority. So all that is packed into John 17:2. You have given, Jesus speaking of himself, him, Jesus, authority over all flesh. To give eternal... Yeah, go ahead.
Just one quick thought. I kind of realized it as we were going over to Daniel 7 portion. It is actually striking and amazing that we essentially have these divine beings, these court officials, if we were to put it into sort of like a kingly court, that they actually want to present this Son of Man.
Well, did Yahweh. They? See, we don't know, right? And all it says is they presented him before him. Do we know whether they liked doing that, or thought that Yahweh would get rid of him, or I don't know. It makes us wonder, why would they present him before him?
I guess you could read it that way. It's just the way that the scene is described. It doesn't sound like he was bound. It doesn't sound like he was under arrest or carried in like a prisoner. I mean, right. He comes in on a cloud, and if anything, it's reminiscent of even the El and Baal relationship, of Baal being on his own cloud and right. riding in some sense, in a victorious scene. And here is this Son of Man riding in on a cloud. It's as though it was a spiritual version of a limousine being presented. Yeah. I don't know. I guess one could read it or just leave it as ambiguous, but the scene doesn't sound like there is hostility at the very least. True.
Now that's a thing where in Revelation we are going to have, again, 10,000 times 10,000 celebrating the authority of Jesus. So that's why a divine rebellion, we have to be careful. Go ahead and talk like this. I know the DCW likes to talk about a divine rebellion, if not 2 or 3 of them. We just don't know the percentage, the number, the frequency of how these beings rebel or not. And so you're right. We don't have a sense of rebellion here, and we won't in Revelation. So just so little we don't know. Can't wait to replay this in the next age and find out how it actually worked. But this we do know, right? Since you have given him authority over all flesh, we know who in that council is given authority. It's not any of the members. It's Jesus himself. You have given him, to finish the line, to give eternal life to all whom you have given him. Fascinating idea again. It's not just, I have all this authority. Jesus says to the Father in a private moment like this, the reason I have all this authority is to give it away, to give it to others, to give it to those whom you have given him. And so we remember that back in Daniel 7, It's often forgotten, actually. But at the end of Daniel 7, after this vision has paralyzed Daniel himself, and then he hears more about what's going to happen, at the very end of Daniel 7, you hear this in verse 27, "The kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the Hebrew for people, the people of the saints of the Most High." We often wonder who the saints are. Are those humans or divine beings? But at least we have the people there. So, you couldn't get any more clear that we're talking about human beings. So, in my understanding, what happens to the Son of Man in Daniel 7:14, who's given all this authority, by the end of Daniel 7, he has given it, or that authority is somehow given to the people of Yahweh. And I think that's, again, what Jesus is referring to here when he says in John 17:3, "You have given, or to give eternal life to all whom you have given him." So in my mind's eye, I am Yahweh's, and now I'm given by Yahweh to Jesus. And Jesus is my high priest, my pioneer, my brother. I mean, you have a lot of analogies there. And he is going to function as my mediator, paraclete. How many words do we want here? He is going to be the one to bring me into the next world based on his being given all this authority. It's a fascinating idea that, again, is packed with much more than we'll ever know. "And this is eternal life," Jesus continues, "that they may know you, the only true God." That's interesting that Jesus would say it that way. Again, we, as divine counsel people, we like to wonder this kind of language. It's only helpful. Here's my opinion as to what Jesus meant by the only true theos. The only aletheia theos, or I forget how the adjective would be formed, but aletheia is the word for true. Here's my opinion. In the Old Testament, Yahweh repeatedly affirms his own uniqueness when compared to other Elohim. We've been through this in many ways, right? Yahweh is Elohim. There is no other besides him, in the sense of who Yahweh is compared to them. Yahweh is our Elohim, Yahweh alone, Deuteronomy 6:4. "Before me no Elohim was formed. I am Yahweh, and besides me there is no Savior, Isaiah 43:10. I am Yahweh, there is no other, Isaiah 45:5. So, and you could multiply this, but comparative monotheism is what I call it. I believe Dr. Heiser called it the same idea, that when we're talking about monotheism, we don't mean there's only one Elohim. That can't be. There's too many passages that bespeak plural Elohim. But the idea that Yahweh among Elohim is the Most High, to the point that there are no others, is a comparative term. So anyway, in John 17:3, here's my opinion. We hear Jesus repeat this theme. His Father, Yahweh, in my opinion, is the only true theos. This has led some interpreters to believe that other divine beings do not exist, or that Jesus himself did not claim divinity. Some have thought that. My opinion would be this. As Israel's Messiah, if you're listening to him pray, how would you expect him to talk? I think Jesus, to read now what I have, Jesus will always restate correct Old Testament theology as originally given. He is the ultimate Old Testament theologian because it's true. And he is going to repeat that language in his own prayer, in his own discussions with others. In other words, we would be surprised if Jesus did not affirm that Yahweh alone is to be considered Israel's theos, incomparable in power, authority, and identity, the only being worthy of ultimate worship. And Paul, 1 Corinthians 11:3, 15:28, Philippians 2:11, you're going to get a lot of verses like this where Paul says, well, let me read it. I got to look it up quick. 1 Corinthians 11:3. I think he's, again, just talking Old Testament theology here. I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is the man, and the head of Christ is the theos, the God. I believe he's talking about the Father there. So those kind of passages are not anti-Trinitarian. They're simply Old Testament theology. And Trinitarianism, whatever it is, to whomever, whatever version you believe in it, there are various versions of it, it's got to accord with Old Testament theology. We're never going to undo what the Old Testament has taken time to express. 1 Peter 1:3 and parallels, the reason I say it that way, you have the God of Jesus, the theos of Jesus. I think it's like 13 times in the New Testament. Jesus has a God, has a theos. Well, what's that mean? Again, in terms of Old Testament ideas, Jesus does have a deity. His name is, in my opinion, Yahweh, or called the Father. So, as for John 17, Jesus was not making any attempt at describing his own divinity. That wasn't his point, since the subject of Christology was not the subject at hand. He's praying to the Father. What else would I expect him to call him but the only true Theos? So, if we have a view or a theology of Jesus' self-understanding, it's got to come from other sources. This is not the place to look for it, in other words. So, a lot there. If I went by too quickly, let me know, Mike. But that's why Jesus said what he did. He's simply aligning himself with good Old Testament theology, and we would be surprised, I would be totally surprised, if he didn't sound like a good Old Testament theologian at any time, especially now. So, that's my understanding. And then Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. I think he's just pulling up, again, the backside of that, where the idea that the sentedness of Jesus is never in question. This is what some have called the functional subordination of the Son. Again, may I read this, because this gets into divine counsel issues, if not, strict orthodoxy, which usually is thought in terms of Trinitarianism. Let me read this. Trinitarian theologians use the phrase functional subordination, if you've ever heard of that, to describe the way the Son relates to the Father without implying any inferiority in his divine nature. That's what you would get as a definition if you look up the term functional subordination. It doesn't imply inferiority to Yahweh in nature. It just shows his function as the Son. So in classical or historical terms, the Son is ontologically equal with the Father, fully sharing the same divine essence. That's a Greek word that is behind that, homoousios. Yet he willingly assumes, a subordinate role in carrying out the Father's will while on earth. That's how we'll hear him in John then, being sent by the Father, John 5, John 6, John 17, like now. Speaking and acting in obedience to him. A distinction is here made then, in this idea, between who the Son is, being equal to the Father, and what the Son does in this functional subordination. He's subjected to the Father in role. This framework has been used by Trinitarians to safeguard both monotheism, Old Testament idea, and what is called the full deity of Christ. Here, may I say, again, I'm not inviting response, but I'm just calling something out. My frustration with my own Christology and Trinitarianism and theology proper discussions over the years. This is going back 20 years, Mike, in my own teaching of it. Once you have a divine counsel worldview in your head, the phrase full deity, quote unquote, becomes nonsensical. What does full deity mean? We're putting two words together. Well, Satan's full deity. Is he a deity or not? Well, sure. In other words, as soon as you have a divine counsel worldview as your backdrop, Michael is a full deity, Gabriel is a full deity. So what did we mean by that? What you find out looking backwards with the DCW in mind, as you look backwards into your systematic theology books, you realize that what people started to do, theologians, even good theologians, they start putting words together like full deity, and they don't mean Satan, Michael, and Gabriel. They mean someone who's related to Yahweh in a deity sense. To which I say then back in under my breath or in the margin of the book I'm reading, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by full deity? When you invent a term like that, you need to express it more clearly for a guy like me or anyone who has a DCW to understand what in the world that even means. Are you hearing my point, Mike? That we use these terms, and I think we're making them up, expecting our audience to know what we mean. But I know I'm confused. I don't know about the rest of you.
I think because we're relearning in some sense the ancient worldview of how both the ancient Israelite and the Second Temple period Jew was exposed to a world of not just Yahweh, but also of other deities, other faiths, other peoples themselves. I think what we often forget is that the language of the church, especially as the centuries went on, is that it was a polemic attempt to really just de-emphasize or, in a sense, strip away the appeal and the power that was associated with the other gods of the other nations, and to accord essentially Yahweh and Jesus all of that. Basically take all of what you would think is a supernatural God and put that only under the creator. And so it's simply just in some sense shame all the others. And you know, we talked about this before, where in some sense we as the church, we are the victims of our own success, at least for the West, because of how successful that was. Essentially, no one goes around for the most part assuming that Zeus is a contender against Jesus.
Yeah.
Right. It's because of that century after century of we are going to accord only this set of names to be accordant with all what we think of as a God, omnipresent, omniscient, that they have all of this underneath that in that definition. And so we have about 2,000 years worth of this kind of momentum that as we're trying to recover.
Yeah. So, and maybe the listeners thinking, Johnson, what's your problem? Why can't you just go with full deity? All I want you to understand is why I'm having trouble. That when we say full deity, we're creating a phrase that the Bible never knew how to, the Bible never would have said Yahweh's full deity and Satan is less than full deity. They would say they're both deities, because that word is simply a category of existence. And for us to call Jesus full deity is kind of code, I think, for Trinitarian language, or at least the foundation of it. And I'm saying let's, even among people with whom I agree, be it the N.T. Wrights of the world and the James Dunns and the Richard Bauchams and you and I, right? We're all talking evangelicalism here. But let's stop using cliches that when you ask yourself what you mean by it, you kind of have to do a wink and say, well, it doesn't mean what the Bible means. It means what we mean. And I'm always, now that I have a DCW in my head, I just don't like doing that. Why can't we go back to how the Bible defines things and not use these invented phrases? But maybe I'm going on too long about it.
Well, actually, well, before we move on, can I ask you, are you saying that you view the functional subordination of the Son as a valid way of looking, or are you saying that this is how history has come up with it? In fact, by the time I'm done reading my point here, I think you'll know where I stand on it. So, because if anything, to make clear, because if this is what I think it is, I think probably a long time ago I wouldn't have blinked at this about the functional subordination of the Son. If this is on the assumption that the Son is eternally submitting to the Father, but, ontologically, yes, he is equal just as the Spirit is, but somehow functionally he is eternally submitting. I'm not sure I personally would be there anymore, especially because of
this is a disputed area. I mean, no doubt about it. You pick up and I've got 30 books on the Trinity. Literally, I've collected them over the years. They are back. I mean, people are back and forth on the issue of functional subordination. It is a hotly contested issue because, how does the Son eternally do it? I mean, it's one thing to say that he came, Philippians 2, and he humbled himself to the glory of the Father. That's how Philippians 2:11 ends. But does he remain in that position eternally? That's where the distinction comes, or at least the discussion. It's the
and the reason, and I'm glad you brought it up, because the reason I bring this up is because I'm not remembering the author's name because we're recording pretty late at night. The book is called Delighting in the Trinity. And one of the things that he pointed out has been this trend within theological camps. It doesn't matter whichever camp. It could be liberal, conservative, traditional, whatever. But the tendency, especially in the 20th and 21st century, has been to use the Trinity as a way to justify another favorite theological position. Right? So to use the Trinity to justify your particular views of human sexuality, for example, or use the Trinity for your own particular angle on what does social justice really mean and look like. And
a lot of people have used the Trinity for arguing for male or female subordination under the male in marriage.
Yes, and functional subordination of the son is often used as a way to justify that and take it even further to other things such as, women leadership, for example. And so, anyways, that's why I was wondering.
And that's why it's contested. I mean, if you go to ETS, as a member, you have to believe in the Trinity, but you don't have to believe in a functional subordination. Many do. And it's contested in paper to paper as to whether the Son is eternally functionally subordinate to the Father. Let me finish this, and I got a couple slides more on it. By locating subordination at the level of role rather than essence, Trinitarians avoid the conclusion that the Son is a created or lesser God, small g, while still taking seriously the New Testament's language of Jesus' obedience, sending, having Yahweh as his God, 1 Peter 1:3, and the dozen or so parallels. Some Trinitarians argue that this functional relationship reflects, here it is, an eternal pattern within the Trinity, sometimes called eternal functional subordination. Sounds pretty heavy, right? My opinion, okay, and you had asked for it, so here is my opinion. A careful historical assessment recognizes that Trinitarianism, to put it in quotes, is not simply a doctrine that drops out of the biblical text in fully formed technical language, but the result of textual reflection working in tandem with historical theology. Here's my point said in more practical terms. The Trinity happens because of both the text and tradition. We work with the text over the course of language, denominational or personal opinions, winners and losers even in some of those debates. And we end with Chalcedonian 351, or is it 451, declarations about the relationship of Father and Son. So, continue to read. The raw materials are undoubtedly or undeniably scriptural. Passages, here's where I would hang my hat, that affirm the Father, Son, and Spirit in uniquely divine roles. I believe they are all divine, and that's a category. It's not full divine or half divine. It's just divine. Enjoying intimate personal relationships. There is a relationship between Father, Son, and Spirit that is absolutely unique among those three. But the conceptual framework that binds those data together, things like, and here's where language just frustrates us, to the nth degree, terms like essence, person, generation, these are all, depending on Latin or Greek or whatever, are disputed back and forth between churches. They emerged through centuries of interpretive labor in the early church, especially in response to competitive explanations by contentious theologians of the past. Some of these, again, they were calling each other heretics based on how they used words. We're pretty much past that to where now today, when you poll your Christian church audience, try this on a Sunday morning. Do you believe, in similar essence, similar person, whatever? Your audience would be confused. Most people don't think this deeply. But back in that day, they fought over what words to use, over how these persons of the Trinity related. So in other words, the doctrine of the Trinity, as understood by modern evangelicalism, is not imposed arbitrarily onto the text, but neither is it a purely organic or self-evident conclusion drawn without the aid of philosophical categories and theological debates. I like to listen to Trinitarian versus non-Trinitarian debates. online. There's some very well thought through people who are continuing to work through this, and it does get very philosophical very quickly among those who do it well, because they realize the words we have in English, Greek, and Latin just don't cut it. It is the product, so here it is the product of the church's sustained effort to articulate what they understood the biblical witness required, all the while believing that they were being guided by the Spirit through countless hours of discussion and even centuries of intense and enthusiastic debate. And we're still there. Most Christians aren't aware that it's still going on, but back to your point, Mike, we won. The Western Church won. And once the victor, stands up and declares victory, they tend to move on. And the debate has moved on from essence and person and ousia and all these terms. Even though I don't think it settled anything, there was a victor, and that victor, is among us. So.
I guess I understand what you mean about on a very practical and historical theology level. Yes, a lot of this was aided by looking at the text and also using the philosophical categories. I mean, especially by the 3rd and 4th centuries, there were not many Jewish Christians left in the church. And so thus there was also a dependence upon a lot of Greco and Roman philosophical categories. Mm-hmm. And also Greek itself, the wordage itself is so ambiguous mm-hmm. in comparison to Latin, for example. I mean, it was one of the things that came up in my Eastern Christianity class was how in the Greek-speaking world, the discussions that led to Chalcedon, for example, was because Greek was more fluid with their understanding of those particular words used in the Nicene Creed. Versus mm-hmm. once you translated it into Latin, it was locked.
And sometimes those words were used differently by different groups. So the same word can mean something else to someone else, and that's where it got very confusing.
Yep. And Dr. Farburn even traced it that the reason why we even had different branches breaking off, such as the Church of the East, the Oriental Orthodox versus the Eastern Orthodox, was because you then compare Greek from the 3rd, 4th century to Greek by around the 7th, 8th century. And even the words, even though they're the same, the semantic default had shifted over the centuries. So you have folks who are speaking Greek natively talking with other Christians who spoke Greek only for liturgical reasons, for church services. And so thus there was even a misunderstanding of what the terms meant anymore by the time you get into the 7th and 8th century. So, I mean, it's part of the issue. And I think one of the reasons why I came to really appreciate Mike's research was when he started talking about the two powers doctrine. And yep. I think that's one of the things that I would love to see a lot of these theologians who discuss about the Trinity bring that into the discussion.
But two powers, help me out here, Mike. Two powers mm-hmm. still has a subordinate and a what's the alternate? Ordinate. In other words, the second power is not equal to the first power. Well, the second power has the name of, has been sent by, has the authority given by the first power. So those two powers do not have the same essence. They do have a functional role, or a one sending the other. Correct?
There is a sense of sending one another, but and also the confusion about the two powers doctrine at times is that the majority of those materials later on in around the 5th to the 8th century, a lot of that was seen as Gnostic because a lot of the Gnostic elements started creeping into that kind of theology mm-hmm. where you essentially had almost like this contention, like there was this opposition. But the earlier versions of the two powers doctrine seems to be more complementary to one another. And I mean, Dr. Heiser, he had done courses at Logos and also at Awakening where it was, he wouldn't say it would bear out a full-on Nicene Creed, but at the same time, these are the proto seedlings that were being planted of this idea of why is Jesus accorded the same glory and authority and is seen to be worshipped on the same level as the Father. And part of that is he's seeing it from the two powers, and also just from ancient Near Eastern literature about El and Baal, that there is this interesting connection that you see one, you see the other, and that they are both to be worshipped and honored in the same way as human beings would give to this ultimate God. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I would just say that, at the last ETS, I was so happy to accidentally discover that they had a whole entire seminar area for Messianic Jewish discussions, and the two powers was brought up. And I'm in a room where all these other theologians had never heard of it. And as the discussions went, and one of these presenters pointed out that even modern Jewish scholars are slowly starting to acknowledge that in many ways, the Nicene Creed seems to be capturing even an ancient version of Judaism than what the rabbis had ever wanted to admit was there. Mm-hmm. And so anyways, it's just a fascinating kind of discussion. I just am happy to see this.
Yeah, and really, let's keep going in John, because we do visit this again, this idea of how these two powers compare. So John 14:4, and now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. Now, that is a stunning statement. I mean, I don't care where you find that in the Bible. Imagine how that would have sounded to the person listening in. The glory that I had with you before the world existed. I take that to be the Daniel 7 thing. How about you? The glory I had with you. You gave me all that glory. To him was given glory, dominion, kingdom, that all peoples, nations. That's where I would posit it before the worlds began. In other words, this is a vision of what God is going to do with the Son of Man. So that's where I put it. Would you put it the same, or would you go back into eternity past, or how would you?
I mean, the way that it says, I'm looking at the verse again.
The glory that I had with you before the world existed.
I would actually take that to be further back into eternity past. All right, because that's part of what's going on with the two powers idea. And Israel's Lord book about the two powers, one of the things that Adam Wynn and his co-writer, they brought up was the concept of, is this second power afforded or even associated with creation itself? And that was one of the things that they brought up, was how wisdom is described as being there with Yahweh in the creation of the world.
Right. Yeah, wisdom is, yeah. And the word of God is.
And the word. Yeah. There is just this interesting kind of thing of like, how is it that Jesus could say he is sharing in the glory before the world existed? Now, I have to look at the Greek, but I'm guessing that he's not just talking about the people at that moment.
Yeah, well, that's very possible. So, thank you. That's what I mean. Jesus is leading us into this conversation by all means, and it's not easy. I have manifested your name. So here, to me, this is functionally. Let me go to it here. I have manifested your name to the people. So it's not the other way around. Yahweh doesn't give Jesus' name. Jesus gives Yahweh's name, or the Father's name, to the people. So to me, that's a functional, some kind of subordination. Whom you gave me out of the world. Yours they were, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Again, to me, that's somehow getting into the... It has to do with the two powers, but even there, one power is giving authority to the other power. Now that they know that everything that you have for me, have given me, is from you. For I have given them the words you gave me, and they have received them and know in truth that I came from you, and they have believed that you sent me. I am praying for them, not for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours. Oh man, there's so much there. We'll have to keep moving, Mike, but I would have loved to have sat over his shoulder listening to this. All mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I am glorified in them, and I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I am coming to you. Holy Father, keep them in your name. So again, that to me speaks of subordination to the Father in some sense, which you have given me, that they may become one even as we are one. Here's where this oneness is going to come back at the end of 17, where when we speak of the oneness of the Trinity, the persons of the Trinity, we got to be careful because, as everyone knows, the oneness that's used in John 17 to describe Jesus and the Father is also spread to believers as well. One, that they may be one even as we are one. It's always helpful, again, I may do it very fast, the 6 defining elements for a DCW. If you're just joining us from 2 years ago when we started all this, there are 6, what I threw out as 6 defining elements for a DCW. They all kind of relate in some way to this oneness of John 17. What verse are we in? 11. Like the first point, you understand the original writer first. You're trying to go for what he said, what he meant. There is number 2, a cosmology of a society of human and divine beings who were created by one almighty deity. That's going to get in here too when it comes to the oneness. Number 3, Yahweh delegated authoritative power to a number of created deities. That's part of our divine council worldview. Christ entered the world. We're jumping all the way into the New Testament now. He's appointed by the Father to the place of highest honor over all gods. And the last 2 points, the locus of salvation will be loyalty to Yahweh above all other gods. And then you move that into the New Testament where, this finished work idea, which we don't have time to get into now. We'll get into it later when the book of John does. But we put it all together in, here's the point, number 6. Believers will be resurrected to assume the status of deityness, the oneness concept that when Jesus talks about having the believers be one, just as you and I, Father, are one, he's rotating this whole doctrine or this whole story of what it means to be loyal to the Father and thus be loyal to what the Father has done with the Son and through the Son, so that we can follow in the footsteps of the Son to become what God has intended for us as believers to finally be. And that is somehow Elohim class beings. This is 2 Peter 1:4. We are participating in deityness is how that phrase works. So a lot going on there, more than, of course, we can take time with, but that this idea of one, that they may be one as we are one, I think it's pulling the whole biblical story into, trying to make sense of what it means as a believer to follow our pioneer into faith, into loyalty. What does it mean for our future, our eternal life? Can we just collapse it into becoming part of a throne room vision of Revelation 4? And my point here on this slide is this whole thing of becoming one with the Father and Son as a believer is all done in the sight of competing spiritual powers. That's the point, that we are, because those powers exist and they have a real authoritative delegated power over the cosmos. But in distinction, I am becoming one through Jesus with the Creator God. That is said in contradistinction to what these beings want, probably, the rebellious ones anyway. And again, so much going on. Continuing on, go ahead.
I'm curious, would it be okay if I read, Mike actually did use John 17 in regards to when he was talking about Jesus and the Father and Yahweh and the name.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So he brings up ironically, he's bringing up John 17, and is in part 7 of his Unseen Realm book, and it's under a subtitle, Jesus as the Name. And so he's going into why his view, and this is, I'm assuming, because he's drawing this from the two powers idea, that he's bringing up the famous prayer that Jesus is praying. And so it then goes on to say, when Jesus tells God the Father that he has revealed God's name to the disciples, 17:6, he isn't talking about telling the disciples what God's name was.
Right.
They could read their Old Testament, see that in thousands of places. Revealing God's name to them meant showing them who God was and what he was like. He did that by living among them as a man. Jesus was God among them. He was the incarnation of God's essence. And then he puts in parentheses Hebrews 1, chapter 1, verse 3. The notion of making God known by revealing his name also takes us back to Yahweh's angel in the Old Testament. Recall that Yahweh's angel was Yahweh in human form. Yahweh's name or presence resided in that angel. Exodus 23, 20-23. John draws on that language in his presentation of Jesus as God. When Jesus says he has kept them in your name, he means he has kept those followers the Father gave to him by means of God's own power and presence, the name, now incarnated in Jesus.
Okay, and that's the verse we're on here, 17:11. While I was with them, I kept them in your name, which you have given me.
And at the end of the section, so, Mike then says the name and Yahweh were interchanged in Israelite theology, so that trusting in the name of Yahweh meant trusting in Yahweh. Likewise, trusting in the name of the Lord, who is Yahweh in the Old Testament quotation, is the same as confessing Jesus as Lord. And he's talking about regarding Romans 10, verses 9-13.
Yep, and I appreciate Mike's view. I don't carry it myself. I think there's a different way to understand the name theology to not be the same being. That's where I would separate. And Mike knew this, that I didn't think that, in other words, for someone to bear the name of the king in that world does not mean you become the king. It means you bear the authority of the king. So as I go to a land and I say, the king says, and I open up the script and I read it in his name, I'm not becoming the king. They know I'm the messenger, but I'm speaking in the authority of the king. So that's the difference of opinion there that we'd be having. And yeah, I would recommend people to understand Mike as well as they can on that. And I'm certainly wanting them to understand Mike. That's a unique view among what's called name theology. Name theology has been with us a long time as to what does it mean to be in the name of someone. To pray in Jesus' name does not mean I become Jesus. It just means I pray in his authority. So that to me is again a difference of opinion as to thus, in other words, someone works in the name of someone else. What does that mean? The result of that now becomes a difference of opinion. Does it mean that they are the actual essence of that person? I would say no. They work in the function of that person, the authority of that person. This is Exodus 23 for me, where the messenger is told by Yahweh, or God tells Moses, listen to this messenger. He has my authority. He has my name. He will not forgive you if, and so forth and so on. But so, yeah. And Mike knew that I disagreed with him on this. So nothing new there, but, I would expect good Christians to disagree on it. This is so hard to nail down as to what it actually means, that Jesus is talking to the Father as though he's a separate person, and he's appreciating or saying, you have done this for me. You have given them to me. You have guarded them, or I have kept them in your name. Not my own. I've given them, or I've guarded them in your name. So he's even there. To me, he's acknowledging the authority of the Father image there somehow, that Jesus is functioning to do something that the Father wants him to do, which he ends by saying, which you have given me. So that even there's functional superiority in some sense, at least in my opinion. So thank you. Moving on, I have guarded them, and none of them has been lost except the son of destruction. Of course, we know who that is. That's Judas, which he chose Judas, apparently knowing back in was it Luke 6, I think, when you have him choosing 12 among others. I think quite early on, Jesus seems to know what's going to happen. But now I am coming to you. There's that line again. And in fact, there's where I want to just pause for a second. Why would the Messiah come and then leave? If you've ever wondered that, I think it's a good question. We know the end of the story, so we kind of presume it, that when Jesus says, I'm going away, we all say, I know. Well, they wouldn't have known that. So let me read what I have here. The Old Testament never plainly says the Messiah will come and then depart from the earth for a time. But there are several passages that in retrospect, and here's the key, in retrospect, they gave the earliest Christians a framework for understanding what happened. So looking back, Psalm 110 can be used in retrospect to describe the Messiah's reign from God's side, right? The Lord said to my Lord, let your enemies be your footstool. So he's reigning from Yahweh's side for a period before the final defeat. So you get this passing of time implied that the Lord, the Adonai, will be at the Messiah, at Yahweh's right hand for a period and have his feet over the enemy for a period of time. And that period of time then, of course, becomes the absence of Jesus. Certainly Isaiah 53 contributed to this expectation in an indirect way. Again, after the event of Isaiah 53, now we can see, as I have here, the servant suffers, he's cut off out of the land of the living, and yet at the end of Isaiah 53, he somehow continues to see his offspring and be exalted. So maybe you get a time element there. From the standpoint of the first disciples, however, Jesus' departure was not predicted and even deeply unsettling. You have to take that into account, that until the very moment Jesus dies, every one of them, including Peter, is saying, no, it's not going to happen. Jewish hopes generally centered on restoration, visible kingship, the defeat of Israel's enemies, and the gathering of God's people. That's what they thought of as a Messiah. And it's not on a Messiah who leaves while the world remains troubled. That idea, I think, is so foreign to them. So this helps explain the emotional weight of John 14 through 16, where he talks like this, where he's preparing his disciples for his going away. He builds on subtle Old Testament groundwork for the idea that Yahweh's rule would be mediated from heaven over rebellious gods rather than through uninterrupted earthly presence. I'm packing a lot into that last sentence, but I think what Jesus is preparing his disciples for, and for us, I mean, we're still living in this interregnum, right, of where Jesus is gone. And how do we handle that goneness of the Messiah is Psalm 110, Isaiah 53. In other words, now we can look back and we have it makes sense, but boy, it's 2,000 years since, and that's what's hard. And that's why the atheist comes upon the world and says, hey, it's, there is no God, or there is no Messiah, because it's still, we're still going through the same thing we have been for centuries. And we, the believer, are saying, no, the story is that there will be an interregnum even longer than any of the disciples could have imagined. And I'm thankful for it because I'm here. Think of it that way. If God had not extended to 2,000 years, the heavenly reign of the Messiah, I wouldn't get to be part of the story, nor would you, Mike. So we are the privileged benefactors of the patience of the Messiah and of God himself in extending his reign over this amount of time. The world has hated, I'm continuing at 14. The world has hated them because they are not of the world. You and I are in some sense not of this system, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. So in some way we're being protected from this world and its leader, even while we live here. They, that's you and I, are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in your truth. Your word is truth. This is the first occurrence of the word sanctify in the book of John. And I don't think we should miss it for what it's the significance of sanctification at this point in the story. If you've heard me much at all, of course, in this podcast and elsewhere, I have an understanding of sanctification that's, I hope, not too unique. I mean, to me, it's unique from what I was taught, but I think it makes common sense that there are three ways that we relate to God's story. The first would be faithfulness to Him. That's what brings righteousness. Abraham, Genesis 15:6. Then when we have sacred space in the Bible, that's like the first tabernacle. Some have thought of, the Garden of Eden as sacred space. That's fine. But certainly by the time you get to a burning bush moment, you get to the tabernacle moment, the temple itself, things like this, you have sacred space, and the Ark of the Covenant would be the classic moment of having a sacred place or item. What allows you to approach that sacred space is what we call atonement in the Bible, or sanctify them. Here's that John 17 now. Sanctify them through your truth. That's not talking about salvation, of course. That's talking about, this sanctify in truth is only here in verse 17 and verse 19. It's repeated twice. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. It's interesting that in 2 Thessalonians 2, again, written to Gentiles, he says this: we always ought to give thanks to God for you, brothers, beloved by the Lord, because God chose you. I think he's talking about Gentile inclusion here. Chose you, Gentiles, as the first fruits to be saved. You are the first set of Gentiles to be joining the Abrahamic family without Torah attached. Through, how does he do it? How does God bring Gentiles into the family of Abraham? Through sanctification by, you'd expect, ritual at this moment, some kind of sacrifice. No, through the Spirit and belief in the truth. How do these Gentiles come to the family? How do they get sanctified even to be to be holy ones and be given right to join the holy family of Abraham? It's through the Holy Spirit. And I think it has to do with the Spirit coming into Thessalonica and bringing signs and wonders to that group, and so that the Jews knew that they were to be enveloped into the family of Abraham at that point. So that's what this sanctify is all about. I've been through this before, so nothing new, but this sanctification is a huge part of so many passages. It's the approaching of a person into sacred space. And that's what Jesus is praying for as he has just left this group. In that, I think John 13-16, where he's washing the feet of this group of people, many of whom are Gentiles probably, and he's showing them what it means to be part of the family and love each other. A new commandment I give you, to love each other, Jew and Gentile and vice versa. So this sanctification moment in John 17 is his hope, as we could multiply the verses of Gentiles coming into the family that had, to this point, never been allowed to, because of what they would understand to be sanctification ritual. I've made this point before, but this is as strong as I get. The principal interest of New Testament writers was not describing how to become righteous. The Old Testament settled that one. Their concern was the reshaping of Abraham's family as believing Gentiles were entering the church while choosing to remain Gentile. That is such a huge issue. Sanctification is the answer to that problem. How do you get Gentiles into the church? You sanctify them through the truth now. You don't have to go through ritual at all. So here's what I think is happening. To sanctify in truth probably plays off the expected idea of sanctifying through atoning ritual. As Jesus had told the Samaritan woman that God wanted to be worshipped in truth, so this is possibly the same idea. Atoning or cleansing ritual is no longer necessary, probably not even available due to the wickedness of the temple and the Roman appointed high priesthood. And the Father is being asked to sanctify his followers through the truth. This is a prayer of Jesus, that God would sanctify them, the believers of Jesus, through the truth.
Ron, quick clarifying question.
Yep.
The sanctifying them by the truth, is that applicable to both Gentiles and Jews?
Probably because the temple, again, if you're a Jew living in, let's say, Rome, how do you get sanctified? You'd be tempted to say, well, I have to go to Jerusalem and, do the thing. And the same answer would be no. Romans 12:1, you present your body a living sacrifice. It's a give your life to God now. It's very practical. You don't have to do the atoning ritual thing. So it especially is what's happening for the Gentiles who needed to be atoned, and they didn't even have the availability of sacrifice. Whereas Paul will go to the temple in Acts 21, is it, and sanctify himself. So you could, as a Jew, go to Israel or Jerusalem and sanctify yourself, but Gentiles weren't even allowed, so they don't even have the privilege of it. But now they do, because of what Jesus will say here, and also what he'll do in his atoning death. That's my understanding. So everyone would be sanctified through truth, but the story that has been happening in Thessalonica and elsewhere is that these Gentiles are being joined to the church through the sanctification by the Spirit. He's showing up in these congregations, doing signs and wonders, showing that, and this is all in Acts 8, 9, 10, and 11, where Peter is seeing the Spirit show up as he did with us, Acts 2. Now he's doing it with them, and he's pointing to the inclusion of Gentiles as a moment in church history where they're being sanctified outside of atoning ritual, which surprised the Jew, I think, to a great degree. What's fascinating is that Jesus even himself says at the end of 17, 19, and for their sake I sanctify myself. Now, I ask it here, why would Jesus need to be sanctified? Because, again, sanctification has nothing to do with moral uprightness or eternal salvation. I say it again, nothing to do with it. Jesus needed to be sanctified. Why? If it was the cultural practice of ritually preparing oneself for entering sacred space, Jesus saw his need for sanctification like everyone else. He may have been referring, I think, to sacred time, however, like Sabbath was sacred time. So you would sanctify yourself in preparation for Sabbath, for example, because of not going somewhere, but entering a time period. So maybe he thought of this next several hours as entering a sacred time, and I give him that one. It does not appear that he saw himself entering sacred space at any point, but he asks the Father, or how does he say it? And for their sake I sanctify myself. How does he do it? Not through ritual, but in some sense, sanctifying through truth again. He prepares himself to enter a sacred moment in the history of the world. That's the best guess I have on I sanctify myself. Jesus himself needed to be sanctified in his mind for what's about to happen.
I mean, wouldn't the cross be seen as a sacred space in of itself? It does become.
It becomes that.
It becomes a sacred space, and if anything, it becomes almost this.
Would you say space or moment in time? Again, space, I'm thinking physical plot of ground.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of plot of ground in the sense of the spot where the cross was. That.
Well, it's in a cemetery. I mean, it's not a sacred space, right? I mean, Hebrews 13 admits he doesn't die at the tabernacle or a temple. He dies out beyond the camp. So I think they knew it wasn't sacred space, as it were. We might think of it that way, but I don't think the world thought of it that way at that time.
Sure. But I'm wondering, because later on, the cross would be seen as essentially like this inversion of a throne, right? Because he essentially goes through the motions of
by
coronation.
Application, it might be sacred space, but again, I'm just thinking practically. It was in a cemetery. It was a Gentile area. He dies in a Gentile cemetery, so it's hardly. And that's why I think the brilliance of Hebrews 13:12. It's he dies outside the camp. That's the whole point. In other words, let's go to him who's outside the camp. Let's actually join the party in non-sacred space. That's why the story of letting sacred space as a concept go, because we can now go to him who's outside the camp, who dies outside the camp. And so Yeah, that's just my view as we've talked over the years together. Sacred space to me is a cultural norm, but it's not God wanting us to, like at this time in my life, I never enter sacred space because it's not a reality. It's a cultural norm of the ancient world. But in my day, I go to work, I come home, I go to church. There's nothing sacred in that sense about my days. And I don't think Paul, if he were here, would want me to think that way. And that's why he doesn't follow Sabbath or doesn't expect Gentiles to follow Sabbath. Is that making sense?
I have to think about that.
I know we make everything. I mean, I think Mike talked this way too, that that we become sacred space and so forth. And I would kid Mike. I would say, well, Mike, if everything's sacred, nothing's sacred. If everything's sacred,
it's a play on the line from The Incredibles too. If everyone's special, then everyone's normal.
Exactly. So as soon as you say everything's sacred or every believer is sacred, I've heard that. Well, no, because then we're all normal. Then it's just, to me, it's a play on words. And again, where does sacredness come from in the whole story of the Bible? It comes from culture, not from God. This is my opinion. God didn't invent sacred space. We are the ones who understood wherever the presence of God was sacred. We are the ones who, Joseph or Joshua meets the commander of the Lord's army in Joshua 5 and is told to take off his sandals. Why? I mean, how does that help? How does that help him stand before a deity to take off his sandals? It's only figurative. It's only, he could have made him do 10 jumping jacks if he wanted to. Moses at the burning bush, take off your sandals. How does that solve sacred space? It doesn't. Moses is still Moses. But the point is, he's giving into the deity's wishes, whatever it might be, to show functional subordination, if not essential or ontological subordination to a deity. So to me, this is, it's part of how humans understood their world. It's not God saying, again, when it comes to Herod's temple, there's no evidence that Jesus thought of that as sacred space. I mean, he goes in and takes a whip to it.
But when his going through and cleansing it, because it was supposed to be a sacred space, and it was instead turned into a marketplace.
Well, does he want? I mean,
there is that line where you have turned my father's house into a den of thieves.
House of prayer. I mean, he wanted it to be a place of prayer, but I don't know if he wants it to be considered.
Well, a house of prayer for the nations.
Yeah. See, so maybe able to. Well, no, we're actually on topic here. This is John 17, where he's praying about sanctification. Did he want it to be? Did Jesus believe Herod's temple was a sanctified or a site of sacred space? Maybe we'll have to just disagree. I would say no. He saw it as a regular plot of ground that had been defiled by Herod and Caiaphas and Annas and all the high priests that had been appointed by the Roman Senate to this point. It was a den of thieves. Yahweh was not being honored there. So did he want it to turn into a sacred spot? I don't know. I don't see. God did not shed a tear when the first temple went down and Daniel went off to Babylon. In fact, if anything, Jeremiah 7, they said, the temple, you can't destroy this place. And God said, watch me. I have no problem letting it go because of your idolatry. So maybe I'm arguing the wrong direction, but to me, the lesson of Paul in Romans 12 is that you don't have to go to Jerusalem. The temple was still standing in Romans 12, right? Did Paul want Jews and Gentiles to go to Jerusalem? I think he would say, absolutely not. Don't bother. Here's what you do. Give your body a living sacrifice. Get busy in the act of worshiping Jesus every day of your life, and let that be everything you need. And don't bother going back. So that's where I am. But I'm glad we have a a bit of a distinction there. I think it's good for everyone to have to decide their decision on that. So
I mean, like to argue like Mike's older point, I get what you mean. Like if everyone is special, everyone is normal. But there is that whole entire thing of Paul, like exhorting the Corinthians, especially to one, acknowledge that their whole body, all the members are part of the structure, or, the spiritual structure of the temple of the Spirit.
Right.
And that yet later he would also then say individually, you are also the temple of the Spirit. You house the presence of the Spirit.
But then he also says, don't forget, he does say we are unclean. We are pots,
Yep.
And
we are jars of clay. Yep.
Yeah. So we're both. I mean, is this not midrash at its finest, where he's going to say, you want to go to the temple? Just go to church, and you're going to meet a priest of the high God the next time you rub shoulders with someone in your little villa there, worshiping Jesus. That's as good as it's going to get. You don't really need to go, to that.
To that particular spot. That I agree with. Yes. Yeah.
All right. Fun discussion. Thank you, Mike, for showing me how there could or should be distinction. Back to Jesus then, that they may be sanctified in truth. So I sanctify myself so that they may be sanctified in truth. I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. There's where you and I show up some 2,000 years later, that they may all, here we go again, be one. Eis in Greek. It is a common word for oneness. Mm-hmm. Just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they may also be in us. This back and forthness of I'm in the Father's in the Son, I'm in the Son, the Son's in me. The word in Greek, again, in Greek, en, is just as fluid and plastic or rubbery, shall we say, as in English. And so it can be used variously. And the beauty of what Jesus is getting at is that his relationship to the Father in relationship, here is that covenant idea again, where my prayer life is not because I like health and money and position and I want things. This is a covenant that I have with the Father and the Son in how I live my life. And it all springs from Jesus himself saying that I and you and me, that they may be one in us. So that, why? The world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me. There's the two powers again, but the glory, notice, is being given from one to the other and not the other way around. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them. Wow. There's that end of Daniel 7 again. To the people of the saints of the Most High. And there's a prediction in Daniel 7 that the saints will be glorified. And here's the statement of Jesus in John 17, that they will be glorified. That they may be one even as we are one. Wow. I in them, you in me, that they may become perfect in one. So that, what's the point of this again? Why do we... Oh, and I fail at this, Mike. Well, we all do, but I know my failure as a Christian is not to not go to things or not do things so that I can be different from non-Christians and that they can say, hey, he's different than me. That's not the point. It's that they may, here we go, that they may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me, because, here again, this is pre-existence, or Daniel 17, or Daniel 7. I see your point, Mike. We could go all the way back before the world began. You loved me before the foundation of the world. That's, to me, Trinitarian type of language. However you want to relate Jesus and the Father, something is happening between those two before the foundation of the world. O righteous Father, even though the world does not know you, I know you, and these know that you have sent me. I have made known to them your name, and I will continue to make it known that the love which you loved me may be in them, and I in them. Talk about words that will ring true for the rest of our own lives on this earth and even into heaven itself. Well, we got to wrap it up for time. Anything else, Mike? Thank you for giving Mike's opinion here and there, and also your own. It's what makes this valuable.
Mm-hmm. I find that this last section is always the most challenging because, like you said earlier, we show up in the story.
Yeah.
But then, so realistically, I don't care the fact that there's so many denominations. People make a big deal about that. To me, it just makes sense because even in America itself, I grew up in a Chinese heritage church. I would not expect a person from the Midwest to show up at the church that I grew up in because of the language and the culture. That, I think, is just an inevitable kind of thing that would happen. But I do find that it is, I would not be surprised if there is a sense of grief at times when we demonize one another over non-essential issues.
Well, and can I thank you for being you? And I can talk like this in front of you for this last hour. And I've had friends who would have turned me right off. They would have said, no, I disagree with you. I can't even fellowship with you Christianly. I've had that happen, right? I've had that happen professionally where I've been dropped from different things based on views. This is where I love Dr. Heiser as a friend. I mean, going back 40 years, this is what we would talk about in the van during baseball trips, hours on end. I forget if I mentioned this to you, but in seminary, we started a club. We called it the Inklings, just patterned after C.S. Lewis. Friday nights, our wives would come and either go in the next room and have fun, or they'd just let us go, and we would, Mike and me and Mike and 2 or 3 other guys, we'd go deep into the night talking about this kind of stuff, not because we could, win arguments, but because we valued each other's opinions on some very heavy topics. I mean, like this, what we did here, this is not light stuff. And good Christians will disagree as to how this works, but the solution is not dividing, as you just as you're saying. It's talking it out in humility, asking, so what do you think? So what do you think? Yeah.
I think that is part of the need at times more often than not. I don't know. Sometimes I'm in the Northeast, and just even knowing we can't even say certain words without being immediately shut down.
Canceled, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And needing to just want there to actually be dialogue and conversation first.
Yeah. Totally believe you. And that's why I appreciate our forum, right? Even in this forum here. So, well, we've been talking a long time. Well over an hour. So thank you for hanging with us, folks. And that's John 17. We could have expanded, I'm sure, on various things, but we took our time, as it were. So thank you, everyone. Until we meet again and get into John 18, have a blessed week, and we'll talk again.